Volume 2, Chapter 17 of The Day Will Come by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. The love of these is like the lightning spear, and shrivels whom it touches. They consume all things within their reach, and, last of all, their lonely selves. The cottage was to be let. A board offering it upon a repairing lease announced the fact. Lord Cheriton opened the familiar gate. The very sound with which it swung back as he passed recalled a life that was gone, that had left nothing but an exceeding bitter sorrow. How weedy and dejected the narrow garden looked in the sunshine, how moss-grown the gravel path which she and Evelyn had once taken such pains to weed and roll, in those early days when that modest suburban retreat seemed a happy home, and the demon of ennui had not darkened their threshold. He entered the well-remembered porch over which the Virginia creeper hung in rank luxuriance. The house was not unoccupied, for slipshod feet came along the passage at the sound of the bell, and he heard children's voices in the back premises. A slatternly woman, with a year-old baby on her left arm, opened the door. "Has a lady called here this morning?" he asked. "Yes, sir, there is a lady here now, in the drawing-room," the woman answered eagerly. "I hope you belong to her, for I've been feeling a bit nervous about her, with me and the children alone in the house, and my husband not coming back till night-time. I'm afraid she's not quite right in her head." "Yes, I belong to her. I have come to fetch her." He went into the drawing-room, the room that had looked pretty and picturesque enough in those unforgotten days, a small room furnished with quaint old secretaire and bookcase, Chippendale chairs, and a carved oak table, a pair of old blue and white jars on the top of a dark mahogany bureau, a high brass fender that used to glitter in the firelight, sober brown damask curtains, and half a dozen Bartolozzi engravings of rustic subjects in neat oval frames, a room that always looked like a Dutch picture. Now that room was a scene of squalor and desolation. For furniture there was nothing but a shabby Pembroke table, wanting 2 casters, and 2 old cane-seated chairs, in each of which the cane was broken and bulging. A dilapidated doll, in a ragged red gauze frock, sprawled amidst the dirt on the bare floor, and a greasy rug lay in front of the fireless hearth. Mrs. Porter was sitting with her elbows on the table, and her head resting on her clasped hands. She did not notice Lord Cheriton's approach till he was standing close beside her, when she looked up at him. At first her gaze expressed trouble and bewilderment, then her face brightened into a quiet smile, a look of long ago. "You are earlier than usual, James," she said, holding out her hand. He took her hand in his. It was hot and dry, as if with a raging fever. It was the hand of a murderess, but it was also the hand of his victim, and he could not refuse to take it. "Was your work over so soon to day?" she asked. "I'm afraid it will be ever so long before dinner will be ready, and the house is all in a muddle, everything wretched," looking about her with a puzzled air. "I can't think what has happened to the rooms," she muttered. "Servants are so troublesome." She passed her hand across her forehead, as if her head were paining her, and then looked at him helplessly. "You are ill, Evelyn," he said gently. It was 20 years since he had called her by the name that had been so often on his lips in this house. It was almost as if the very atmosphere of the house, even in its desolation, recalled the old link between them, and made him forgetful of what had happened in Dorsetshire. "No, I have a headache, that is all. I shall set to work presently, and make everything comfortable for you. Only I can't find Mary. I can't get on without Mary. I don't like the look of that charwoman, a wretched untidy creature, and I don't know what she has done with the furniture. I suppose she moved it in order to clean the rooms. It is just like their tricks, clearing out the furniture and then dawdling ever so long before they begin to scrub the floors." He looked at her earnestly, wondering whether she was pretending, whether she had repented that written acknowledgment of her crime, and was simulating madness. No, it was real enough. The eyes, with their dull fixed look and dilated pupils, the troubled movements of the hands, the tremulous lips, all told of the unsettled brain. There was but one course before him, to get her madness established as an accepted fact before there was any chance of her crime being discovered. "Do not trouble about anything," he said gently. "I will get some of the furniture brought back presently, and I will get you a servant. Will you wait quietly here while I see about 2 or 3 small matters?" "Yes, I will wait, but don't be long. It seems such a long while since yesterday," she said, looking round the room in a forlorn way, "and everything is so strangely altered. Don't be long, if you must go out." He promised to return in half an hour, and then he went out and spoke to the woman. "How did she come here? And when?" "She walked up to the door. It was just dinner time, 12:30. I thought it was some one to see the house, so I let her in without asking any questions, and I showed her all the rooms, and it was some time before I saw she was wrong in her head. She looked about her just as people mostly do look, and she was very thoughtful, as if she was considering whether the place would suit. And then, after she'd been a long time looking at the rooms and the garden, she went back into the drawing room and sat down at the table. I told her I should be glad if she could make it convenient to leave, as I had my washing to do. But she said she lived here, this was her home, and she told me to go away and get on with my work. She gave me such a scare that I didn't know how to answer her. She spoke very mild, and I could see she was a lady, but I could see she was out of her mind, and that frightened me, for fear she should take a violent turn and I all alone in the house with those young children. I was afraid to contradict her, so I just let her please herself and sit in the drawing room alone while I got on with my bit of washing, and kept the children well out of the way. I never felt more thankful in my life than when you rang the bell." "I am going as far as the post office to send off some telegrams, and I want you to take care she doesn't leave this house while I'm away," said Lord Cheriton, emphasizing his request with a sovereign. "Thank you kindly, sir. I'll do my best. I'm sure I'm sorry for her with all my heart, poor dear lady." "And I want you to give me the use of this house for to day, and possibly for to night, if by any chance I should not be able to get her away to night." "Yes, sir, you are free and welcome to the house as far as it's mine to give leave, and it's been empty too long for there to be much chance of a tenant turning up between now and to morrow." "Very good. Then I shall send in a little furniture, just enough to make her comfortable for a few hours, and when I come back you can get her something to eat and make her some tea." "Yes, sir. You won't be gone long, I hope, for fear she should turn violent." "She will not do that. She has never been violent." "I am very glad to hear that. Appearances are so deceitful sometimes when folks are wrong in their heads." Lord Cheriton had told the cabman to wait. He got into the cab and drove to the nearest upholsterer's, where he hired a table, a comfortable sofa, a couple of chairs, a small square carpet, and some pillows and blankets in the event of Mrs. Porter having to bivouac in Myrtle Cottage. He meant her only to leave that shelter for a place of restraint under medical care. This done, he went to the post office and telegraphed first to Marian Gray, Hercules Buildings. "Your mother is at Myrtle Cottage, Camberwell Grove, and very ill. Go to her without delay. Cheriton." His second telegram was to Dr. Mainwaring, Welbeck Street. "Meet me as soon as possible at Myrtle Cottage, Camberwell Green, and send a trained nurse, experienced in mental cases, to the same address. I want your advice upon a case in which time is of vital importance." He sent another telegram to another medical man, Dr. Wilmot, also an old acquaintance, and a fourth to Theodore Dalbrook at the Priory. "Mrs. Porter is in London, and in my care. You need have no further apprehension." He was back at Myrtle Cottage within the half hour, and was able to direct the men who had just brought a small van containing the furniture. He saw the things carried into the room that had been the dining room, which was empty, the policeman's family preferring to camp in the kitchen, and had them arranged there with some appearance of comfort. Then he went back to the drawing room, where Mrs. Porter was standing at the window, staring at the weeping ash. "I didn't know the tree was so big," she muttered. "The dining room is in better order," he said gently. "Will you come and sit there, while they get you some tea?" "Yes, James," she answered meekly, and then she added, with almost the voice and manner of 20 years ago, "Tell me about your day." She followed him into the other room, and seated herself opposite him, looking at him expectantly. "Tell me about your day in the Law Courts. Was it dull or interesting? Had you any great case on? I forget. She had always questioned him on his return from the Law Courts. She had read the reports of all his cases, and all his rivals' cases, interesting herself in everything that concerned his career. And now there was so much of the past in her manner that his heart ached as he listened to her. He could not humour her delusion. "I have sent for your daughter," he said gravely, thinking that name might bring her back to a sense of the present time. "She will be here before long, I believe. I hope you will receive her kindly." Why have you sent for her?" she cried, vexed and startled. "She is very well where she is, happy and well. The nurse told me so in her last letter. I can't have her here. You know that, James. You know how people would talk by and by, and how they would ferret out the truth, by and by, when we want to stand clear of the past. Evelyn, the past is long past, and our child is a woman — a sorrowful woman. I want you to take her to your heart again, if you have any heart left in you." "I have not," she cried, with a sudden change, appalling in its instantaneousness. "My heart died within me 20 years ago, when you broke it — in this house, yes, in this house, James Dalbrook, God help me! I have been dreaming. I thought I was living here again in the old time, and that you had come home to me, as you used to come, before you broke your promise and abandoned me to marry a rich young wife. Heart? No, I have a fiery scorpion here, where my heart used to be. Do you think if I had had a heart I could have killed him — that young man who never injured me by so much as one scornful word? It was the thought of your daughter that maddened me — the thought of her happiness, the sound of the church bells and the cheering, and the sight of the flags and garlands and laurel arches, while my daughter — your nameless, unacknowledged child — was an outcast, and I who should have been your wife, and the happy mother of just as happy a bride, I was living in that silent, solitary cottage alone and unloved, upon the land where my father and his forefathers had been owners of the soil. I had dreamed the dream, and you had realized it. All through those moonlight nights I was awake and roaming about in the park, from midnight till dawn, thinking, till I felt as if my brain must burst with the agony of thought. And then I remembered Tom Darcy's pistols, and I took one of them with me of a night. I hardly knew why I carried that pistol about with me, but I felt a necessity to kill something. Once I was near shooting one of the red deer, but the creature looked at me with its plaintive eyes, so bold and so tame in his sense of security, and I fondled him instead of killing him. And then I took to prowling about by the house, and I saw those two in the lamp-lit room, in their wedded happiness, James, not such a union as ours, secret, darkened by a cloud of shame. I saw your daughter in her bright young beauty, the proud, triumphant wife, and then a devilish thought took hold of me, the thought of seeing her widowed, broken hearted, the thought that I might be her evil destiny, that just by stretching out my arm and pulling a trigger I could bring down all that pride into the dust, could bring youth and beauty down to my level of dull despair. It was a devilish thought. It was, but it was my thought all the same. For 3 days and 3 nights it was never absent from my mind. God knows how I got through the common business of the day, how the few people with whom I came in contact did not see murder in my face. I watched and waited for my opportunity, and when the moment came I did not waver. There are old people at Cheriton who could tell you that Evelyn Strangway at 15 years old was as good a shot as either of her brothers. My hand had not forgotten its cunning, and your daughter was a widow 3 weeks after she was made a wife. By so much as she was happier than I, by so much was her joy briefer than mine." She sank into a corner of the large armchair and covered her face with her hands, muttering to herself. He heard the words, "I made myself her evil destiny. I was her fate. Nemesis, nemesis. The sins of the fathers. It is the scripture." He could not stay in the room with her after that confession. She had been perfectly coherent in telling the story of her crime, and it seemed to him that even now she gloated over the evil she had wrought, that had it been in her power to undo her work by the lifting of her hand she would hardly have used that power. She seemed a malignant spirit rejoicing in evil. He went out into the passage and told the policeman's wife to look after her, and then he went to the desolate drawing room and walked up and down the bare boards, waiting for the arrival of one or both of the doctors. What would they think of her mental condition? She had been curiously coherent just now. The temporary delusion had passed away like a cloud. She had spoken as a person fully conscious of her acts, and accountable for them. Judged by her speech just now, she was a criminal who deserved the sternest measure of the law. But he, who knew of those long years of brooding, he who knew the story of her wrongs, and how those wrongs must have acted upon that proud and stubborn spirit, to him there seemed little doubt that her mind had long lost its balance, and that her crime had been the culminating crisis of a long period of melancholia. He waited the verdict of the doctors with acutest anxiety, for only in an asylum did he see safety for this unhappy sinner. The finding of the pistol would inevitably be talked about at Cheriton, and it was possible that at any moment suspicion might take the right direction. To get her away, to get her hidden from the world was his most ardent desire, but this was not inconsistent with his desire to spare her, to do the best that could be done for her. The thought that he had ruined her life, that his wrong doing was at the root of all her miseries, was never absent from his mind. Dr. Mainwaring was the first to arrive. He was a man of supreme refinement, gentle, compassionate, an artist by talent and temperament, intellectual to the tips of his fingers. He had made insanity and the care of the insane the work of his life, as his father and grandfather had done before him, and he enjoyed the privilege of having been born in an age of enlightenment, which they had not even foreseen in their happiest anticipations. He had met Lord Cheriton often in London society, and had visited him in the country, and they were as close friends as two busy men of the world can be. He was mystified by so sudden a summons and to such a locality, but he had too much tact to betray any surprise. He listened quietly to Lord Cheriton's explanation that he was wanted to form an opinion of a dependant whose state of mind had given him cause for uneasiness. "I will say very little about her till you have seen her," said Cheriton. "If it should appear to you and to my friend Wilmot, whom I have asked to meet you, if you should decide that she ought to be placed under restraint, I should wish her to be removed immediately to your house at Cheshunt. I know that she will be made as happy there as her state of mind will admit, and I shall rely upon your kind consideration for making this a special case." "You may be assured I shall do my uttermost for anyone in whom you are interested, my dear Cheriton, but indeed I think you must know that I do my uttermost in every case. It is only in some small details that I can ever show special attention. Is this poor lady very violent?" "No, she is very quiet." "And there is no suicidal mania, I hope?" "I have seen no evidence of it. But she left her home in a strange and motiveless manner this morning, and that, coupled with other indications in the past, gave me the alarm." "Has she any delusions?" "Yes. It was under a delusion that she came to this empty house. She lived here many years ago, and on talking to her just now I found her unconscious of the lapse of time, and fancying that all things were still as they were when she was a young woman." "Has she had any illness lately?" "None that I know of." "I fear there can be little doubt as to her malady. Will you take me to her? She will be less alarmed if you are with me. Oh, by the by, the nurse you asked for will be here almost immediately." "I am glad of that. There is only a wretched slattern in the house, whom I don't like to see in attendance upon my poor friend." Lord Cheriton and the doctor went into the room, where Mrs. Porter was sitting facing the window, staring moodily at the trailing tendrils of Virginia creeper and passion flower hanging from the roof of the veranda and shutting out the light. There was something unspeakably desolate in that glimpse of neglected garden seen athwart the neglected verdure, with the smoky London sky as a background. She looked round quickly at the sound of footsteps, and started up from her chair. "Who is this man?" she asked, turning to Lord Cheriton. "Are you going to send me to prison? You have lost no time." "This gentleman is my old friend, and he is interested in helping you if he can." "You had better leave us together," said Dr. Mainwaring gently. Lord Cheriton left the room silently, and paced the narrow entrance hall, listening with intense anxiety to the low murmuring sound of voices on the other side of the door. There were no loud tones from either speaker. There could be neither anger nor profound agitation upon Mrs. Porter's side, the listener thought, as he awaited the result of the interview. A knock at the hall door startled him from his expectancy, and he hastened to admit the new arrival. It was his other medical friend, Dr. Wilmot, stout and jovial, more adapted to assist at a wedding than a funeral, more fitted to prescribe from wine-bibbing aldermen or dowagers who needed to be "kept up" on Roederer or Mumm, than to stand beside the bed of agony or listening to the ravings of a mind distraught. Mainwaring came out of the dining room at the sound of voices in the hall. "Ah, how do you do, Wilmot? You will have very little trouble in making up your mind about this poor soul. Go in and talk to her while I take a turn in the garden with his lordship." He opened the dining room door, and Dr. Wilmot passed in, smiling, agreeable, and beginning at once in an oily voice. " My dear lady, my friend Mainwaring suggests that I should have a little chat with you while Lord Cheriton and he are admiring the garden. A very nice garden, upon my word, for the immediate vicinity of London. One hardly expects such a nice bit of ground nowadays. May I feel your pulse? Thanks. A little too rapid for perfect health. What do you and that other man mean by all this pretence? " she exclaimed indignantly. " I am not ill. Are you a doctor, or a policeman in disguise? If you want to take me to prison, I am ready to go with you. I came to London on purpose to give myself up. You need not beat about the bush. I am ready." Mad, very mad, thought Dr. Wilmot, detaining the unwilling wrist, and noting its tumultuous pulsations by the second hand of his professional watch. Lord Cheriton and Dr. Mainwaring were pacing slowly up and down the moss-grown gravel while this was happening. " How did you find her? "" Curiously calm and collected for the first part of the interview. Had it not been for her troubled eye, and the nervous movements of her hands, I should have supposed her as sane as you or I. I talked to her of indifferent subjects, and her answers were consecutive and reasonable, although it was evident she resented my presence. It was only when I asked her why she had come to London that she became agitated and incoherent, and began to talk about having committed a murder, and wishing to give herself up and make a full confession of her guilt. Instead of waiting for the law to find her out, she was going to find the law. She had no fear of the result. She had long been tired of her life, and she was not afraid of the disgrace of a felon's death. Her whole manner as she said this showed a deep-rooted delusion, and I am of opinion that her mind has been unhinged for a long time. That notion of an imaginary crime is often a fixed idea in lunacy. A madman will conceive a murder that never took place, or he will connect himself with some actual murder, and insist upon his guilt, often with an extraordinary appearance of truth and reality, until he is shaken by severe cross-examination. You will receive her in your house at once? I have no objection, if Wilmot's opinion coincides with mine; but another medical man must sign the certificate if she is to enter my house. I have no doubt as to her being in a condition to require restraint. She is not violent at present, but if she is not taken care of she will go wandering about in search of a police magistrate, and with increasing excitement there will be every likelihood of acute mania. Ah, here comes Wilmot. Well, what do you think of the case, Wilmot? Mad, undeniably mad. She took me for a policeman, and raved about a murder for which she wanted to give herself up to justice. A fixed delusion, you see, said Mainwaring with a gentle sigh. Do you know how long she has had this idea, Cheriton? Indeed, I do not. Her position on my estate was a peculiar one. She lived at one of the lodges, but her status was not that of an ordinary dependent. She was her own mistress, and lived a very solitary life — after her daughter left her. I have sent for the daughter, who will be here presently, I hope. My first notice of anything amiss was a hint dropped by a young medical man who was visiting at Cheriton. He saw Mrs. Porter, and formed the opinion that she either had been off her head in the past, or was likely to go off her head in the future. That startled me, and I had it in my mind to ask you to come down to see her, Mainwaring, when there came the sudden departure of this morning, a departure which was so at variance with her former habits that it made me anxious for her safety. I followed her to London, first to her daughter's lodging, and then here, where by mere guesswork I found her. Do you think that it may be the sad event of last year, the murder of your son-in-law, which has put this notion into her head? It is not unlikely. That dreadful event made a profound impression upon everybody at Cheriton. She, being a reserved and thoughtful woman, may have brooded over it. Until she grew to associate herself with the crime, said Wilmot. Nothing more likely. Was the murderer never found, by the way? Never. But there can be no suspicion against this lady, I conclude. She can have been in no way concerned in the crime. I think you only have to look at her in order to be satisfied upon that point, said Lord Cheriton, and the two physicians agreed that the poor lady in question was not of the criminal type, and that nothing was more common in the history of mental aberration than the hallucination to which she was a victim. Those monotonous lives of annuitants and genteel dependents, exempt from labour, and to the outward eye full of placid contentment, do not infrequently tend towards madness, said Dr. Wilmot. I have seen more than one such case as this. There are some minds that have no need of action or variety, some natures which can vegetate in harmless nullity. There are other tempers which prey upon themselves in solitude, and brood upon fancies till they lose touch of realities. This lady is of the latter type, highly organized, sensitive to a marked degree, of the genus irritabile." "You will take all necessary steps at once," said Lord Cheriton, looking from one doctor to the other. Both were consentient. Dr. Wilmot drove off at once to find the nearest medical man, and brought him back in his carriage. A very brief interview with the patient convinced this gentleman of the necessity for gentle restraint, and the certificate was signed by him and Dr. Wilmot. It was 6 o'clock, and the shadows were deepening in the room where Mrs. Porter was sitting, quiescent, silent, in a kind of apathy from which she was scarcely roused by the entrance of the nurse from Cheshunt, a tall, comely looking woman of about 30, neatly dressed, and with pleasant manners. Mrs. Porter sat there in her dull lethargy, the food that had been prepared for her untasted at her side. The nurse looked at the patient with a keen professional eye, and from the patient to the tray where an ill-cooked chop stagnated in a pool of grease, and where the unused teacup showed that even the feminine refreshment of tea had failed to tempt her. "She hasn't eaten anything," said the nurse, "and she looks weak and wasted, as if she had been for a long time without food. You'd better send for some beef essence and a little brandy. She ought to be kept up somehow, if she is to be taken to Cheshunt to-night. It will be a long drive." Lord Cheriton dispatched the policeman's wife to the nearest chemist's and the nearest wine merchant's, while he went himself to a livery stable and ordered a brougham and pair to be at Myrtle Cottage at 7 o'clock. The certificate had been signed, and there was nothing to hinder the removal of the patient. He found Mercy with her mother upon his return, but the mother had given no sign of recognition, and the daughter sorrowfully acknowledged the necessity of the case after Dr. Mainwaring had gently explained her mother's condition to her. "I am not surprised," she said with sad submission. "I saw it coming years ago. I have lain awake many a night when I was a girl listening to her footsteps as she walked up and down her bedroom, and to the heart-broken sigh that she gave every now and then, in the dead of the night, when she thought there was no one to hear her." An hour later, the woman who for 20 years had been known as Mrs. Porter, and who was to carry that name to her dying day, was on her way to the Grange, Cheshunt, with her daughter and the nurse in the carriage with her. She had made no resistance, had gone where she was asked to go, with an apathetic indifference, had given no trouble; but although her daughter had been with her for an hour, doing all that tender attention could do to awaken her memory, there had been not a word or a look from the mother to betoken consciousness of her existence. Yet it was clear that the mental powers were only clouded, not extinguished; for as Lord Cheriton stood a little way outside the porch, watching her as she passed out to the carriage, she stopped suddenly and looked at him. "Will you and I ever meet again, James Dalbrook?" she asked solemnly. He paled at the address in those clear, incisive tones, dreading what she might say next. "I think it may be better we should not meet," he said gloomily. "I have placed you in the care of those who will do the best that can be done for you. You are sending me to a madhouse in the care of a mad doctor. That is your substitute for Cheriton Chase, the home I used to dream about ages ago, in this house, the home you and I were to have shared as man and wife. It was my birthplace, James, and I would to God it had been my grave before I ever looked upon your face." The nurse hustled her charge into the carriage, muttering something about delusions; but Dr. Mainwaring was too shrewd a student of humanity not to perceive some meaning in these consecutive utterances. He had no doubt that Mrs. Porter was deranged, and a person who would be the better for the moderate restraint of a well-ordered asylum, but he had also no doubt that she had her lucid intervals, and that in this farewell speech she had let in the light upon her past relations with James Dalbrook, 1st Baron Cheriton. That revelation accounted for some points in the law lord's conduct which had hitherto been incomprehensible to his friend the doctor. Chapter 18. Volume 2, Chapter 18 of The Day Will Come by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. Mine after life. What is mine after life? My day is closed. The gloom of night is come. A hopeless darkness settles o'er my fate. It seemed to Lord Cheriton as he drove to Victoria Street in Dr. Mainwaring's brougham that the day which had just come to an end had been the longest day of his life. He looked back at the sunny morning hour in which he had lingered over the business of the toilette, brooding upon that discovery of the pistol, his spirits weighed down by a vague foreboding, a dim horror of approaching evil, scarcely able to measure the extent of his own fears. He recalled the moment at which his valet brought him Theodore's brief summons to the West Lodge, a moment that had given new reality to all he dreaded, a summons which told him that the shadowy horror which had been beside his pillow all through the night was going to take a tangible shape. Oh, God! How long it seemed since that pencilled line was put into his hand, since he stood in the blinding sunshine staring at the curt summons, before he recovered himself so far as to turn to his servant with his habitual grave authority, and give some trivial order about his overcoat. Since then, what slow agonies of apprehension, what self-abasement before the daughter whom he met for the first time as his daughter, face to face. What terror lest the woman whom his perfidy had driven to madness and to crime should be called upon to answer to the law for that crime, while England should ring with the story of his treachery and his hidden sin. He felt as if he had lived through half a lifetime of shame and agony between the vivid light of the August morning and the cool grey shadows of the August night. He leant back in his corner of the cosy little brougham, pale and dumb, a worn-out man, and his friend the physician respected his silence. "Will you come and dine with me, Cheriton?" said Dr. Mainwaring as they crossed the bridge. "It may be pleasanter for you than the solitude of your own rooms." "You are very good. No, I am not fit for society, not even for yours. I am deeply indebted to you. I feel that you are indeed my friend, and that you will do all that can be done to make that broken life yonder endurable." "You may be sure of that. I would do as much were Mrs. Porter a nameless waif whom I had found by the roadside, but as your friend she will have an unceasing interest for me. Shall you stay long enough in town to be able to spare time to go and see her at the Grange?" "No, I must go back to Dorsetshire to morrow. I doubt if I shall ever see her again. Accept that fact as the strongest proof of my confidence in you. Had I any doubt as to her treatment, I would see her from time to time, at whatever cost of pain to myself." "There is nothing but pain, then, in your present feeling about that poor lady?" "Nothing but pain." "And yet, forgive me if I touch an old wound, I think you must have once loved her." The shadows were deepening, the lamps shone with faint yellow light upon the grey stone parapet, and the interior of the carriage was very dark. Perhaps it was the darkness which emboldened Dr. Mainwaring to push his inquiry to this point. "You are right," his friend answered slowly. "I loved her once." The brougham stopped at his lordship's door in Victoria Street, and then drove northwards with the physician. There was time for much serious reflection between Westminster and Welbeck Street. "My new patient must be carefully looked after," mused the doctor, "for I'm afraid there's more meaning in her self-accusation than there generally is in such cases, and that Sir Godfrey Carmichael's murderer is now in my keeping." The long August day passed very quietly at Milbrook Priory. Lady Cheriton arrived in the afternoon, and the three generations spent the summer hours on the lawn, mother and daughter sitting at work under the tulip trees, grandson and nurse in that state of perpetual motion which is infancy's only alternative with perpetual slumber. Theodore spent his afternoon in a somewhat restless fashion, and appeared as if possessed by a rage for locomotion. He rambled about the grounds, explored the shrubberies, and every yard of the plantation that girdled the little park. He went to both lodges, and talked to the caretaker at each. He made 2 different excursions to the village, on pretence of making inquiries at the post office, but in reality with the idea of meeting with, or hearing of, Mrs. Porter, should she have wandered that way. He behaved like a member of the secret police who had been charged with the guardianship of the most precious life in the land, and if his movements betrayed the nervous anxiety of the amateur, rather than the business-like tranquillity of the professional, he made up in earnestness for what he lacked in training and experience. It was on his return from his second sauntering perambulation of the village that he found Lord Cheriton's telegram waiting for him at the Priory. The relief that message brought was unspeakable, and his countenance showed the change in his feelings when he rejoined the 2 ladies on the lawn. "Something very pleasant must have happened to you, Theodore," said Juanita. "You have been looking the picture of gloom all day, and now you are suddenly radiant. Have you been talking to one of the Vicar's pretty daughters?" "No, Juanita. Neither of those wax doll beauties glorified my path. I heard their treble voices on the other side of the holly hedge as I passed the vicarage, and I'm afraid they were quarrelling. I have had good news from London." "From my father?" "Yes." "Oh, Theodore, Why do you torture me by hiding things from me? Something has happened, I know." "You will know all in a few days, Juanita. Thank God, a great fear that has haunted me for some time past is now at an end. I can look at you and your child without seeing the shadow of an enemy across your path." She looked at him searchingly. "All this amounts to nothing," she said. "I have never feared for myself or thought of myself. Will my husband's death be avenged, and soon, soon, soon? That is the question." "That is a question which you yourself may be called upon to answer, and very soon," he said. He would say no more, in spite of her feverish eagerness, her impatient questionings. "I have changed my mind, Juanita," he said presently. "I will not bore you with my company till I am free to answer your questions. The motive for my presence in this house is at an end." "Is it? What has become of the suspicious characters my father talked about?" "The danger has not come this way, as he feared it might." "Stay," she said. "Whether there is danger or not, you are going to stay. I will not be played fast and loose with by any visitor. Mother likes to have you here, and baby likes you." "Not so well as he likes Cuthbert Ramsay," retorted Theodore, with almost involuntary bitterness. This time Juanita's blush was an obvious fact. She walked away from her cousin indignantly. "You may go or stay, as you please," she said, and he stayed — stayed to be a footstool under her feet if she liked — stayed with a heart gnawed by jealousy, consumed by despair. "It is useless — hopeless beyond the common measure of hopelessness," he told himself. "She never cared for me in the past, and she never will care for me in the future. I am doomed to stand for ever upon the same dull plane of affectionate indifference. If I were dangerously ill she would nurse me; if I were in difficulties she would load me with benefits; if I were dead she would be sorry for me; but she is fonder of Ramsay, whom she has seen half a dozen times in her life, than she will ever be of me." Lord Cheriton returned to Dorsetshire on the following afternoon. He drove from Wareham to the Priory, and had a long tete a tete with Theodore in the garden before dinner. "You have acted for my daughter throughout this miserable business," he said, when he had told all that was to be told about Mrs. Porter's seclusion at Cheshunt. "She has confided in you more completely even than in me, her father, and I leave my cause in your hands. You must plead to the daughter for the erring father, whose sin has exercised a fatal influence upon her life. Win her forgiveness for me. Win her pity for that most unhappy woman, if you can. It is a difficult task which I entrust to you, Theodore, but I believe in your power to move that generous heart to mercy." "You may believe in my devotion to you both," said Theodore, and Lord Cheriton left the Priory without seeing his wife and daughter, who had gone to dress for dinner just before his arrival, and who came to the drawing room presently, both expecting to find him there. Theodore explained his hasty departure as best he might. "Your father drove over to speak to me upon a matter of business," he said to Juanita. "He was tired after his journey, and preferred going home to dine." "He was not ill, I hope?" cried Lady Cheriton, with a look of alarm. "No, there is nothing amiss with him except fatigue." Juanita looked at him intently, eager to question him, but the butler's entrance to announce dinner stopped her, and she told Theodore to give his arm to her mother and follow them both to the dining room. The meal was a mockery as far as 2 out of the 3 were concerned. Juanita was nervous and ill at ease, impatient of the lengthy ceremonial. Theodore ate hardly anything, but kept up a slipshod conversation with Lady Cheriton, talked about the grandchild's abnormal intelligence, and assured her in reply to her reiterated inquiries that her husband was not ill, was not even looking ill, and that there was no reason for her to go back to the Chase that night, as she was disposed to do. Juanita rose abruptly before the grapes and peaches had been taken round. "Would you mind coming to my room at once, Theodore?" she said. "I want half an hour's talk with you about business. You will excuse my leaving you, won't you, mother?" "My dear child, I shall be glad to get half an hour in the nursery. Boyle tells me that little rascal is never so lively as just before he settles down for the night." Lady Cheriton went off in one direction, Juanita and Theodore in the other. The lamp was lighted in the study, on the table were 2 rows of books told of the widow's studious solitude. Theodore glanced at the titles of those neatly arranged volumes, and saw that they were mostly upon scientific subjects. "I did not know that you were fond of science, Juanita," he said. "I am not. I used to hate it. I am as ignorant as a baby. I don't believe I know any more about the moon than Juliet did when she accused it of inconstancy. Only when one comes to my age one ought to improve oneself. Godfrey will be asking me questions before I am much older, and when he wants to know whether the earth goes round the sun or the sun round the earth, I must be prepared to answer him." She spoke with a nervous air, facing him in the soft, clear lamplight, her hand upon the row of books, her eyes eager and questioning. "You have seen my father, Theodore. Is the embargo removed?" "It is." "And you know who murdered my husband?" "So far as the assassin's own confession is to be believed, yes." "He has confessed. He is in prison. He will be hanged," she cried breathlessly. "The murderer has confessed, but is not in prison, and will not be hanged, at least I trust not, in God's mercy." "You are full of pity for a murderer, Theodore," she cried bitterly. "Have you no pity for my husband? Is his death to go unpunished? Is his life, the life that might have been as long as it was happy, is that to count for nothing?" "It is to count for much, Juanita. Believe me, your husband is avenged. His death was a sacrifice to a broken heart and a disordered brain. The hand that killed him is the hand of one who cannot be called to account, the hand of a mad woman." "A woman?" "Yes, a woman. The woman you have seen many a time as you passed in and out of Cheriton Chase in your father's carriage by the west gate." "Mrs. Porter?" "Yes." "Great God! Why did she kill my husband?" "Because she was unhappy. Because she had suffered until sorrow had obscured her intellect, till her life had become one long thirst to do evil, one hatred of youth and beauty, and innocent gladness like yours. She saw you in your wedded happiness, and she thought of a happiness which was once her own day dream, the hope and dream of patient, self-denying years. She struck at you through your husband. She struck at your father through you." "My father? What was he to her, ever, except a friend and benefactor?" "He was once more than that to Evelyn Strangway." "Strangway!" shrieked Juanita, clasping her hands. "Did I not tell you so from the first? It was the footstep of a Strangway that crept past our window while we sat together in our happiness, without thought of peril. It was a Strangway who killed my husband. You told me that they were all dead and gone, that the race was extinct, that the people I feared were phantoms. I told you it was a Strangway who fired that shot, and you see my instinct was truer than your reason, and there was a Strangway at our gates, disguised, under a false name, looking at us with smooth, hypocritical smiles, nursing her wrath to keep it warm." "Unhappily your instinct hit upon the fatal truth. The hatred of the Strangways was not dead. One member of that family survived, and cherished a more than common malignity against the race that had blotted out the old name." "But my father, how had he provoked her hatred?" "He once loved her, Juanita, many years ago, before he saw your mother's face. Evelyn Strangway and he had been lovers, pledged to each other by a solemn promise. As a man of honor he should have kept that promise. There were stringent reasons that bound him. But he saw your mother and loved her, and broke with Evelyn Strangway, openly, with no unmanly deceit; but still there was the broken promise, and that involved a deep wrong. He believed that wrong forgiven. He believed the more in her pardon because it was her earnest desire to live unrecognized and unnoticed upon the estate where she was born. He could not fathom the depth of hatred in that warped nature. He did all that there was left to him to do, having taken his own course and entered upon a new and fairer life with the woman he loved, to make amends to the woman he had deserted. He never suspected the depth of her feelings. He never suspected the seeds of madness with its ever present dangers. He did what in him lay to atone for the sin of his youth, but that sin found him out, and it was his bitter lot to see his beloved daughter the innocent victim of his wrong doing. He trusted me to tell you this miserable story, Juanita. He humbles himself in the dust before you, stricken at the thought of your suffering. He appeals, through me, to your love and to your pity. How am I to answer him when I answer for you?" She was silent for some moments after he had asked this final question, her eyes fixed, her chest heaving with the stormy beating of her heart. "What has become of this woman, this pitiless devil?" she gasped. "She is in a madhouse." "Is no punishment to overtake her? Is she not to be tried for her life? Let them prove her mad, or let them find her guilty, and hang her, hang her, hang her. Her life for his, her worn out remnant of wretched, disappointed days for his bright young life, with all its promise and all its hope. It would be a poor revenge, Juanita, to take so poor a life. This unhappy woman is under restraint that will, in all probability, last till the day of her death. Her crime is known only to your father and to me. Were it to become known to others, she would have to stand in the dock, and then the whole story would have to be told, the story of your father's broken promise, of this woman's youth, bound so closely with his that to many it would seem almost as if they stood side by side at the bar. Do you think that the fierce rapture of revenge could ever atone to you for having brought dishonor upon your father's declining years, Juanita? And my husband's death is to go unavenged? Do you think there is no retribution in the slow agony of a shattered mind, the long blank days of old age in a lunatic asylum, the apathy of a half extinguished intellect varied by flashes of bitter memory? God help and pity such a criminal, for her punishment must be heavier than hemp and quicklime. She seemed scarcely to hear him. She was walking up and down the room, her hands clenched, her brows contracted over the fixed eyes. "I caught just one glimpse of her as we drove past. But that glimpse ought to have been enough," she said. "I can see her face as we passed the lodge, looking out at us from the parlor window, within a few hours of my darling's death, a pale, vindictive face. Yes, vindictive. I ought to have understood. I ought to have taken warning, and guarded my beloved one from her murderous hate." "What am I to say to your father, Juanita? I ought not to leave him long in doubt. Think what it is for a father to humiliate himself before his daughter, to sue for pardon." "Oh, but he must not do that. I have nothing to forgive. How could he understand that there could be such diabolical malignity in any human breast? How could he think that the wrong done by him would be revenged upon that innocent head? Oh, if she had gone a nearer way to revenge herself, if she had killed me rather than him! It is such bitterness to know that my love brought him untimely death, that he might have been here now, happy, with long years of honor and content before him, if he had chosen any other wife. It is hopeless to think of what might have been, Nita. Your husband was happy in your love, and not unhappy in his death. Such a fate is far better than the dull and slow decay which closes many a fortunate life, the inch by inch dissolution of a protracted old age, the gradual extinction of mind and feeling, the apathetic end. You must not talk as if your husband's death was the extremity of misfortune. It was, for me. Can I forget what it was to lose him? Oh, there is no use in talking of my loss. I wanted to avenge his death. I have lived for that, and I am cheated of even that poor comfort." "What shall I say to your father?" "Say that I will do nothing to injure him, or to distress my mother. I will remember that I am their daughter, as well as Godfrey's widow. Good night, Theodore. You have done your uttermost to help me. We cannot help it, either of us, if fate was against us." She gave him her hand, very cold, but with the firm grasp of friendship. The very touch of that hand told him he would never be more to her than a friend. Not so is a woman's hand given when the impassioned heart goes with it. End of chapter 18. Volume 2, Chapter 19 of The Day Will Come by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. A malady preys on my heart that medicine cannot reach, invisible and cureless. Mrs. Porter's evanishment created considerable talk in the little village of Cheriton, and would doubtless have been the occasion of still greater wonder but for the impenetrable stupidity of the young maid servant, from whom no detailed account of her mistress's departure could be extorted. Had the girl Phoebe been observant and loquacious, she might have stimulated public curiosity by a lively narrative of events, setting forth Theodore Dalbrook's emotion at finding the lodge deserted, and how he had sent up to the house for his lordship, and how his lordship and Mr. Dalbrook had remained in earnest conversation for nearly an hour in the lodge parlor, and how Mrs. Porter had left a mahogany box upon the table, a flat mahogany box with brass corners, which Phoebe had never seen before, and how this very box had disappeared mysteriously when the two gentlemen left. All this would have afforded mental pabulum for the acuter wits of the village, and would have formed the nucleus of an interesting scandal to be uttered with bated breath over the humble tea tray, and to give zest to the unassuming muffin in the back parlors of small rustic shopkeepers. As it was, thanks to Phoebe's admirable stolidity, all that was known of Mrs. Porter's departure was that she had gone to London by the early train on a certain morning, and that her luggage had been sent after her, address unknown. It was the general opinion that Mrs. Porter had had money left her, and that she had reassumed her position in life as a genteel personage. This afforded some scope for speculative gossip, but not for a wide range of conjecture, and in less than a month after Mrs. Porter's departure the only talk in relation to the West Lodge was the talk of who would succeed the vanished lady as its occupant. This thrilling question was promptly settled by the removal of the head gardener and his wife from their very commonplace abode in the village to the old English cottage. Cheriton was furnished with a more interesting topic of discourse before the end of October, when it was "given out" that Lord and Lady Cheriton were going to winter abroad, an announcement which struck consternation to a village in which the great house was the centre of light and leading, and the chief consumer of butcher's meat, farm produce, over and above the supply from the home farm, and expensive groceries, not to mention hardware, kitchen crockery, coals, saddlery, forage, and odds and ends of all kinds. To shut up Cheriton Chase for 6 months was to paralyze trade in Cheriton. To draw down the blinds and close the shutters of the great house was to spread a gloom over the best society in the neighbourhood, and to curtail the weekly offertory by about 1/3. Everybody admitted, however, that his lordship had been looking ill of late. He had aged suddenly, as those fine, well set up men are apt to do, said Mr. Dolby the doctor. He looked careworn and haggard. The village solicitor hoped that he had not been dabbling with foreign loans, or had invested blindly in the fortune of an impossible canal, yet opined that nothing but the Stock Exchange could make such a sudden change for the worse in any man. Mr. Dolby declared that Lord Cheriton's lungs were as sound as a bell, and that if he were ordered abroad it was not on account of his chest. Everybody pitied her ladyship, and talked of her as despondingly as if it had been proposed to take her to Botany Bay in the days of transportation for felony. It was so cruel to separate her from her flower gardens, her hothouses, her poultry yard, and her daughter, for all which things a correct British matron was supposed to exist. To take her from these placid domestic pleasures, from these strictly ladylike interests, and to plunge her in a hotbed of vice such as Monte Carlo, as pictured by the rustic mind, would be a kind of moral murder. Cheriton recovered its equanimity somewhat upon hearing that his lordship was going to winter at Mustapha Superieur, but it was opined that even there baccarat and Parisian morals would be in the ascendant, and a photograph of a square in Algiers, which looked like a bit broken off the Rue de Rivoli, was by no means reassuring. Yet, whatever Dr. Dolby might say as to the soundness of his lungs, there remained the fact that his lordship had altered for the worse since the shooting season began. He, who used to go out daily with the guns, had this year not gone with them half a dozen times in the whole season. He, whose active habits and personal superintendence of his estate had been the admiration of his neighbours, had taken to staying at home, dreaming over Horace or Juvenal in the library. Yes, Lord Cheriton was a broken man. From the hour in which his daughter had laid her head upon his breast, and sobbed out fond words of compassion and forgiveness for the weakness and the sin that had brought about her one great sorrow, from that hour James Dalbrook's zest of life dwindled, and the things that he had cared for pleased him no more. His heart sickened as he rode his cob by the familiar lanes, and surveyed wide-spreading cornfield and undulating pasture, sickened at the thought of that wretched creature whose dream he had darkened, whose long-cherished hope he had ruthlessly disappointed. The image of Evelyn Darcy, eating out her heart in the dull monotony of a private madhouse, came between him and that sunlit prospect, haunted and tortured him wherever he turned his eye. He had to give up the quiet morning rides which had once been the most restful portion of the day, his thinking hours, his time for leisurely discursive meditations, for indulgence in happy thoughts and humorous reverie. His wife saw the change in him, knowing nothing of the cause, and urged him to take advice. He gratified her by seeing Sir William Jenner, confessed to being fagged and out of spirits, and obtained just the advice he wanted: complete change of scene, a winter in Egypt or Algiers. "We'll try Algiers first, and if we don't like it we can try the Nile," he said, and his wife, who would have gone to Vancouver Island or Patagonia just as cheerfully, forthwith ordered her trunks to be packed, and began to take leave of her grandson, an operation which would require weeks. They left England in the middle of November, just when the last leaves were being stripped from the oaks and beeches by the blustering southwest wind, which is a specialty in that part of the country, where it comes salt with the bitter breath of the sea, and sometimes thick and grey with sea fog. Mrs. Porter had been nearly 3 months at Cheshunt Grange, and Theodore had been 3 times to see her, in that carefully chosen retreat, and on 2 of those visits had met her daughter Mercy, who went to her twice a week. He had found Dr. Mainwaring's patient strangely calm and tractable, professing herself contented with her life, and having established her reputation among the other patients as a lady of blameless character and reserved manners. "I sometimes wonder how they would feel if they knew what I did that night," she said to Theodore once, with a sinister smile. "They think me a commonplace person. They call my complaint nervous debility. Nobody here would believe me if I were to tell them that I murdered a man who never offended me by so much as an uncivil word. They don't believe that such a deed as that would be possible in our day and in our country. They think it was only a couple of centuries ago, in southern Europe, that women knew the meaning of revenge." This was the solitary occasion on which she spoke of her crime. On the other visits he found her apathetic. Although she was elaborately polite, it was evident that she did not recognize him. She had, however, recognized her daughter, and now received her with some faint show of tenderness, but not without a touch of fretful impatience. It was evident that Mercy's presence gave her no pleasure. "I go to see her as often as Dr. Mainwaring allows me," Mercy told Theodore, as they walked to the station together. "It is all I can do, and it is very little." "Have you thought any more of Lord Cheriton's earnest desire to improve your position? Have you learnt to take pity upon him, to think more kindly of him, on account of all he has suffered?" "I am very sorry for him, but I can never accept any favour at his hands. I can never forget what my mother's life has been like, and who made her what she is." "And is your own life to be always the same, a monotony of toil?" "I am used to such a life, but I have some thought of a change in my employment. I had a long talk with your friend Mr. Ramsay last night at Miss Newton's, and through his help I hope to learn to be a sick nurse. I should be of more use to my fellow creatures in that capacity than in stitching at fine needlework for rich people's children." "It would be a hard life, Mercy." "I am content to live a hard life. I had my span of a soft life, a life of idleness on a summer sea, amidst the loveliest spots upon earth, a life that would have been like a glimpse of heaven itself, if it had not been for the consciousness of sin and disgrace. Do you think I forget those days on the Mediterranean, or forget that I have to atone for them? The man I loved is dead. All that belonged to that life has vanished like a dream." They parted at the railway station, she to go to her place in a dusty third-class carriage, he to a smoking carriage to smoke the meditative pipe, and think sadly of those 2 blighted lives which had been ground beneath the wheels of Lord Cheriton's triumphal car. Cheriton Chase was deserted, the blinds down, the servants on board wages, the flower beds empty and raked over for the winter; but at Millbrook Priory all was life and movement. The sisters and their husbands were again established in their favourite rooms. Lady Jane was again at hand to assist her daughter-in-law to bear the burden of a family party, and all was much as it had been in the previous winter, except that Juanita had a new interest in life, and was able to take pleasure in many things that had been an oppression to her spirits last year. Most of all were her feelings altered towards Mrs. Grenville and her nursery. She was now warmly interested in the history of Johnny's measles, and deeply sympathetic about that constitutional tendency towards swollen tonsils which was dear little Lucy's weak point. For must not her Godfrey inevitably face the ordeal of measles, and might not his tonsils show a like weakness at the growing age? All those discussions about nursery dinners, the children who fed well and the children who fed badly, those who liked milk puddings and those who could not be induced to touch them, the advisability of a basin of cornflour or bread and milk at bedtime, the murderous influence of buns and pastry, and the lurking dangers of innocent seeming jam, all these things, to hear of which last year bored her almost to exasperation, were now vital and spirit-moving questions. The little visitors' nurseries were near the infant Sir Godfrey's rooms, and it was a delight to find the baby taking pleasure in his youthful cousin's society, and revelling in their noise. His own young lungs revealed their power and scope as they had never done before, and led the infant orchestra. Juanita spent hours in this noisy society, sitting on the floor to be crawled over by her son, who was just beginning to discover the possibility of independent locomotion, and to have her hair pulled affectionately by the younger Grenvilles, who found her the most accommodating playfellow. She insisted that the children should dine at the family luncheon table, much to the gratification of their mother and grandmother, and to the exasperation of Mrs. Morningside, who, having left her own children with their conscientious governess and nurses in the north of England, did not see why her midday meal should be made intolerable by the boisterous egotism of her nephews and nieces. This was the condition of things at Christmas when Theodore reappeared at the Priory, having come to Dorchester for his holidays, after 3 months' earnest work. He had been reading with a man of some distinction at the Chancery Bar, and he had been writing for one of the law journals. He was struck by the change in his cousin. She looked younger, brighter, and happier than she had ever looked since her husband's death. No one could accuse her of having forgotten him, of having grown indifferent to his memory, for at the least allusion which recalled his image her expression clouded, and her eyes grew sad. But there could be no doubt that the dawn of a happier existence was beginning to disperse the darkness of her night of grief. The influence of her child had done much, the solution of the mystery of her husband's death had done more to relieve her mind of its burden. She was no longer tortured by wonder, her thoughts were no longer forced to travel perpetually along the same groove. She knew the worst, and pity for her father prompted her to try to forget the wretch who had blighted her young life. She received Theodore with all her old kindness, with that easy cordiality which was of all indications the most hopeless for the man who loved her. She took him to the nurseries, where Christmas fires blazed merrily, and Christmas gifts strewed the carpet, a plethora of toys, a litter of foil paper and gold and silver fringe, and tissue paper cocked hats and Pierrot caps, from the wreck of cracker bonbons. The children were masters of the situation in this Christmas week. "It is their season," said Juanita tenderly. "I don't think we can ever do too much to make our children happy at this time, remembering that he who made the season sacred was once a little child." She took her baby up in her arms as she spoke, and pressed the little face lovingly against her own. "Why does Mr. Ramsay never come to see me?" she asked, with a sudden lightness of tone. "He used to be so fond of baby." "He is working hard at the hospital." "And he is not to have any holiday with you?" "I fear not." Her manner in making the inquiry, light as it was, told him so much; and he noticed how she bent her face over the child's flaxen head as she talked of Ramsay. "Why does he work so hard?" she asked, after a silence. "He has never given me any reason, yet I have my own idea about his motive." "And what is your idea?" "Have you ever heard of a man trying to live down a hopeless attachment, trying to medicine a mind diseased with the strong physic of intellectual labor? That is my case, Juanita. And I am inclined to think that it may be Ramsay's case, too. He has altered curiously within the last few months. I cannot get so near his inner self as I used to get, but I know him well enough to form a shrewd opinion." "I am sorry for you both," she said, with a little nervous laugh, still hiding her face against the baby's incipient curls and wrinkled pink skin. "I am sorry you should be so sentimental." "Sentimental, Nita? Is it sentimental to cherish one love for the best part of a lifetime, knowing that love to be hopeless all the time? If that is your idea of sentimentality, I confess myself sentimental. I have loved you ever since I knew the meaning of the word love, and I have gone on loving you in spite of every discouragement. I loved you when your love was given to another. Yes, I stood aside and harbored not one malevolent thought against the man you had so blessed and honored. I have loved you in your sorrow, as I loved you years ago in your light-hearted girlhood. I shall love you till I am dust, but I know that my love is hopeless. Your very kindness, in its level uniformity of sweetness, has told me that." "Dear Theodore, if you knew how I value you, how I admire and respect you, I think you would be content to accept my sisterly regard," she said, looking up at him with tearful eyes. "Perhaps, had we met differently, as strangers, I might have felt differently, but from my earliest remembrance you have been to me as a friend and brother. I cannot teach myself any other love." "Ah, Nita, that other love comes untaught. You want no teaching to love Cuthbert Ramsay. Don't be angry. I can't help speaking of that which has been in my mind so long. I saw my doom in your face when Cuthbert was here. I saw that he could interest you as I had never interested you. I saw that he brought fresh thoughts and fancies into your life. I saw that he could conquer where I was beaten. You have no right to say that." "I have the right that goes with conviction, Juanita, and with disinterested love. I have the right of my loyal friendship for the man who has shown himself loyal to me. Unless you or I make some sign to prevent him, Cuthbert Ramsay will have made himself an exile from this country before the new year is a month old." "What do you mean, Theodore?" "I mean that he is in treaty with the leader of a scientific expedition to the Antarctic Ocean. The ships will be away 3 years, and if he join that expedition as doctor he will be absent for that time, with the usual hazard of being absent for ever." "Why is he going?" "He has never given me any reason, but I suspect that the reason is you." "Theodore!" "If I read his secret right, he left this place deeply in love with you. He knew I loved you, and that was one reason for a man of his generous temper to withdraw. You are rich and he is poor. That makes another reason. He is too honorable to come between his friend and his friend's love. He is too proud to offer himself with only his talents and his unfulfilled ambition to a woman of fortune. So he takes his old mistress Science for his comforter, and is going to the other side of the world to watch the planets in the polar skies, and to keep the crew free of fever and scurvy if he can." 3 years!" faltered Juanita. "It would not be so very long anywhere else. But those polar expeditions so often end in deaths." "Shall I tell him not to go?" "Pray do." "I'm afraid I shall hardly prevail with him, unless—" "Unless what?" "Unless you will let me say that you wish him to stay." She blushed deepest crimson, and again had resource to the baby's pink little head as a hiding place for her confusion. "Tell him anything you like. Ask him to come and romp with the children next Easter. He is fond of children, and I'm sure he would like my nephews and nieces." "Ah, Theodore!" she cried, holding out her hand. "Now you are indeed my brother. Forget that you ever wished to be more, and let me hear of your having found a new love by and by." "By and by is easily said, Juanita." What would that by and by have revealed could the curtain of the future have been lifted that Christmas Eve, as the children danced in the shadowy room while their elders sat beside the fire in the winter dusk? A coffin brought by land and sea, and laid with stately ceremonial in the cemetery at Dorchester. A respectful obituary notice of Lord Cheriton, with a laudatory biography setting forth his remarkable gifts and his honourable career; much wonderment among his lordship's friends at the premature termination of that prosperous life; a man of 60 who had looked 10 years younger, and whose vigorous constitution and grand bearing had denoted one of the semi-immortals, a Brougham, a Lyndhurst, or a St. Leonards. What else? A lovely matron, proud of her handsome Scotch husband and his scientific successes, reigning over one of the most delightful houses in London, a house in which the brightest lights of the intellectual world are to be found shining in a congenial atmosphere. Sir Godfrey Carmichael's widow, now Cuthbert Ramsay's wife, and one of the leaders in all movements that tend towards the welfare and enlightenment of mankind. What else? A rising barrister, living quietly in a secluded old house at Chiswick, with a sweet, serious-looking wife, and 2 lovely babies, supremely contented with his lot and with his home, which is managed for him with that perfection of art which conceals art. His wife and he are exactly of the same age, have the same deep love of good books, good pictures, and good music, and the same indifference to frivolous pleasures and fashionable amusements. They have a few friends, carefully chosen, and of choicest quality, and amongst the most honoured of these is Sarah Newton, still brisk and active, though her abundant hair is snow white, and there are the deep lines of age about her shrewd and kindly eyes. They have their garden with its old cedars, and old walls shutting off the world of gig and villa respectively. They have their boat house and boats, in which they live for the most part on summer evenings, and they have hardly anything left to wish for, except a loch and weir. The barrister is Theodore Dalbrook, and his wife's name is Mercy. He found her 4 years ago established as nurse at Cheshunt Grange, administering to her mother till the day of her death, which happened by a strange fatality within a few hours of that other death in Algiers, a sudden death by cerebral apoplexy, swift as a thunderclap. He found her there, and saw her frequently in his duty visits to the asylum, visits paid in performance of a promise to his unhappy kinsman, and little by little that sympathy which he had felt for her in the first hour of their acquaintance warmed and ripened into love, and in Mercy, the woman who had sinned and paid the bitter penalty of sin, he found the consoling angel of his disappointed youth. The world knows nothing of her story. That dead past is buried deeper than ever ship went down into the treacherous waters of the tideless sea. To Mercy herself, in her plenitude of domestic bliss, it seems as if it was another woman who shed those bitter tears and drank that cup of shame. The world knows only that Theodore Dalbrook has a lovely and devoted wife, who thoroughly understands and realizes the duties of her position. Lord Cheriton's will, executed 3 months before his death at Mustapha Superieur, bequeathed a life interest in the sum of £20,000, consols to Sarah Newton, spinster, the principal to go to Mercy Darcy, otherwise Mercy Porter, upon that lady's death. End of Chapter 19. End of The Day Will Come, by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Recorded by Céline Major.